Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. For those of you on the East Coast, we just bumped right over the noon hour, and good morning to everybody who's joining in from further west. Welcome to session 4 of the Disability Inclusion Dialogue on connecting the finance and private sectors to drive disability inclusion. My name is Merrill Friedman. I am sitting in my home office, as many of us are throughout COVID-19. I have a few pictures, I think 3 right behind me from the days when we used to travel in airports and spend some time in New Orleans, some jazz photos. I have mostly short, mostly gray curly hair. And I'm thrilled to be with everybody today. As our presenters introduce themselves going forward, we will start with our names and give brief descriptions of ourselves. And so thank you for your patience through that, but we want to be as accessible and inclusive for everybody who's joined us today. Here we go. Each of the panel presentations, right, that we have hosted throughout this year, I have been extremely honored to be able to participate in many of them. This is a true privilege for me and have learned something from every single speaker. I hope you all who have tuned in have done the same. You certainly will today. But focusing on identifying those solutions that permanently change the system so people with disabilities are fully integrated and included in companies at all levels. Equal pay, equal recognition, equal responsibility, equal influence. So, as some of you may have heard in those prior sessions, the genesis for these conversations has been a white paper that was sponsored by the Harkin Institute and Goal 17 partners entitled Solving Then What? Empowering Investors to Achieve Competitive Integrated Employment for People with Disabilities. The first recommendation of that paper is to bring together the private sector investors in the disability community to identify ways in which investors can leverage the $40 trillion worldwide that is managed under social and environmentally responsible investment frameworks to drive greater inclusion of people with disabilities into all levels of the private sector, as we've discussed, from entry-level positions to boards of directors. We know this is possible. Today's session specifically is going to focus on gaining insights from the investor community in the private sector about how we can foster greater collaboration to push disability inclusion higher on the agenda of organizations across the private sector. Very timely conversation as society. Here we are in the midst of redefining how we work, where we work, how we collaborate, how we foster inclusion and diversity across workforces. As Suzanne Briere of the Youngton Institute of Employment and Disability at Cornell University and a participant in our very first panel observed, and I'll quote her here, "I have never seen companies so excited to see something work that is not just driven by compliance. This is not a checkbox." She didn't say that, I just added that. It really is the smart, proactive companies that are reassessing how they do business and who are the people they need to bring in so they can thrive. I can tell you here at Anthem, when we talk inclusion and we talk equity, we are talking about people with disabilities. We are talking with people with disabilities. We are including people with disabilities and how we can be very intentional in our hiring processes and practices because we are so excited and we know people with disabilities are part of our success as well as everybody else's. Investors can be catalysts in systemic change in achieving a more diverse and inclusive economy. Investors do not look at workforce development as a charity. They want companies to hire the best people, regardless of who they are or where they come from, and then retain that talent. So it's what we do as companies and as people with disabilities when we get into the companies to grow and to succeed and to have an equal seat at all the tables at all levels. Equation is simple. If a company does not hire or retain good people, it will fail to innovate, be unable to attract new customers, experience ethical missteps, and lose its market share. People with disabilities are part of the solution here. We are part of progress. We are part of wins and successes. This critical moment plays directly into the strengths of the disability community. Time and time again, people with disabilities have shown themselves to be innovative, adaptable, creative, and comfortable using all forms of technology to excel in their roles. I, on the other hand, am not great at all forms of technology, even though I've got the others covered. So put simply, a truly diverse workforce adds value. Goes beyond that. That's too simple even. Carol Nolan Drake, one of the participants in another panel that we had done, said diversity in all its forms adds value, especially in times of turbulence and uncertainty when there are no easy answers. I think we can all identify with those times today. So today's discussion is going to be focused on that point. How can we better collaborate across multiple sectors of the economy to achieve a more diverse workforce that has disability inclusion at its core? Not only at its core, at the helm. This is not about charity once again. It's about taking action and making us, successful in the work that we're doing, creating value for every organization and every person while spurring the innovation we need to make the world a better place. So here we go. I'm going to introduce the panel now, but I got to tell you, I'm so excited about the discussion that I'm going to cover just a few high-level points of their backgrounds because they are very lengthy. This is going to be a great discussion, but their backgrounds are going to shine through during the discussion. So you will pick up on the nuances that I left out just to get, chatting here. Again, I am Merrill Friedman. That is me. I am the RVP of Inclusive Policy at Anthem and the executive sponsor of one of Anthem's 9 business resource groups, which is ABLE, our Disability Inclusion Network, and also one of the members of our Inclusion and Diversity Council for the Anthem enterprise, which covers about 87,000 associates. So very important that we're paying attention. So Amy, I'm going to do your introduction. First, Amy Frederick is the president of U.S. Insurance Solutions with Principal Financial Group, serves nearly 100,000 employers, more than 3.5 million people, and she leads 3,500 employees responsible for group employee benefits, life insurance, and disability insurance. Amy is chair of Principal's Executive Inclusion Council and has appeared on the podcast Diversity Straight Up and production that digs into topics of equity, diversity, inclusion, and engagement through conversations with C-suite leaders from around the country. It's important, though, to note that companies like Principal that have made accessible innovation of flexible workplace services driving the future for how we work, and Amy will have a lot of great insights to share about her leadership and Principal's experiences. And I'm going to catch up with Amy offline, too. Super excited to follow it there at that point. Jessica Tuman. Jessica leads Voya Care Center of Excellence, which is committed to making positive difference in the lives of people with disabilities and their caregivers, providing advocacy resources and solutions through the workplace to help individuals and caregivers plan for their financial future and retirement. Voya Cares is an extension of Voya Financial's vision and mission to help all Americans achieve the quality of life they seek today through their retirement. They are New York-based financial services and help plans invest and protect the savings to get ready to retire better. I may need to follow up on that too. I'm getting ready, getting closer every day. Voya is dedicated to integrating disability inclusion into the firm's health, wealth, and investment strategies, which is super important and what we're talking about here today. Mike Hess. Mike's the founder and executive director of Blind Institute of Technology, an organization out of Denver, Colorado, working hard to advance the professional opportunities for people with disabilities. I got to tell you all a fun story is just very quickly. Mike and I just met, I think the other day this week to find out that he's actually been working with Anthem. So I'm very excited. That's what happens in big companies. Sometimes you don't know all the cool stuff that's taking place, but great surprises. Through partnerships with such Fortune 500 companies as Aetna, Spectrum, DaVita, First Bank, and here we go, most recently Anthem, VIT has celebrated employment success in areas such as web development, business analysis, and finance. Before launching VIT, Mike was a 20-year tech veteran and in 2019 developed Edge Guide, which is a navigation system that allows independent navigation in previously inaccessible public spaces. So check it out, Edge Guide, EDGGUIDE, in case you need the spelling there. So welcome everyone, super excited. And just as a reminder, we're gonna kick off on some Q&A here today. And as you begin to speak the first time, please do a description of yourself, and then we'll try to note when we're starting and stopping. We do miss every so often when we get really excited about the discussion. So let's start with the connection between disability inclusion and business value. We've already teed up that people with disabilities are part of the inclusive workforce, very important part of the inclusive workforce and the success of companies. So as we dig in further, Jessica, I'm going to start with you. If you would please begin to talk about big picture and explain how disability inclusion is critical to driving stronger business performance and creating value for companies.
Absolutely. Thank you, Merrill, for that introduction. And I'm so delighted to be here today. Merrill, this is Jessica Tuman. Audience, this is Jessica Tuman. I have dark brown hair with a background which says Voya Cares, the group that I lead. And I'm wearing a black top with orange flowers, just to keep with the orange theme. So just to answer your question, I think, the bigger picture right now, and as we've sort of, as we dive into the pandemic still, it is such a critical time for companies to lead by example, to really positively impact this group. Right now, we have this tremendous employment and labor shortage. And this group of talent is often overlooked. Right now, we're actually looking at agencies that supply people with disabilities with this labor shortage, because we know that people with disabilities have exceptional problem-solving skills, and they represent a massive community. The reason why we started Voya Cares was because we recognized that 1 in 4 Americans has a disability, visible or non-visible. And with that, we had to provide financial solutions and support for retirement, because that's what we do. We're a retirement company and we provide health solutions. So we could not overlook this group of people that are very much underserved. So we are proactive in supporting the disabilities community in hiring and recognizing that this is, in this new world of remote work, the transportation barriers are removed from many of the positions that we have. So with that, it's an ideal and opportune moment for companies to support the inclusion of people with disabilities in their workplace. And what we've found over the last few years is that not only does it strengthen our company culture, our employees are so proud to be part of a company that has a really proactive stance on inclusion of the disability community in particular. We try and include all segments of minorities, but disabilities kind of cuts through all of them. There's intersectionality between all of the groups. 1 in 4 Americans represents about over 100 million people. So we recognize that this is such a large group of folks. And what they do internally within Voya is that they help represent their community, their needs. So when we're doing product development, when we're doing marketing pieces, we use them as a test bed. People are vocal, and our employees are vocal about their communities, and they'll give us very candid feedback in marketing pieces and solutions and the way we come across in our products and solution set. So that's that diverse thinking really comes to life when you do have an organization that values that kind of diverse thinking. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention that, Voya is so committed, Voya Cares and Voya is so committed to disability inclusion. And this was not something that we set out to do, because what we set out to do was to include people with disabilities in our workforce and our products and solutions. But a real amazing side effect has been our brand, how it's impacted our brand. And now you'll see that, our materials, our commercials have people with disabilities, sometimes visible, sometimes not. But that's the side effect that we didn't really foresee. But we're now known as the thought leaders and providers for solutions for this community.
Thank you, Jessica. This is Merrill speaking again. I appreciate your insights. Yes, and it's always good to remind people how diverse the disability community is, and that it's multiple communities oftentimes as well. I also want to share there has been a recommendation that I do not talk quite as fast today. I will tell you there's just water in this cup, but apparently I've just been excited. So we'll slow down a little bit on that and make sure everybody can capture the full dialogue. So Amy, I'm going to turn to you now. If you can explain just a bit more about Principal's efforts to foster accessible innovation and a more adaptable workforce, and some of the lessons learned that can apply to organizations of all kinds.
Sure. Thank you, Merrill. And this is Amy Frederick. Thanks for the kind introduction. Just to give you a quick physical description, I'm holding on to still pretending I'm a blonde. If I let it go natural, that wouldn't be, it would be sort of this darker brown color but I'm still pretending. So kind of longish, lighter, blondish hair. I won't kind of give you much more than wearing black today. I would call it almost signature black for me, and some nice gold shiny buttons to add a little bit of accent. Just a little bit about Principal and the role that I have. Merrill mentioned this, but I have, sort of the day job responsibilities that obviously I take very seriously about running Principal's insurance businesses, all of our insurance businesses. And so what that gives me the pleasure, though, of doing is providing things like disability insurance to hundreds of thousands of Americans. And so we take that responsibility very seriously. And when I wear the hat of running a profit and loss center, I wear that hat proudly, that we provide insurance that really matters to people who have needs, whether they're temporarily out of work, have had a permanent situation change for them. We're providing that income protection. So that's one of the great things I get to do in my day job. The other pieces of my job are things like I help provide the chair position for our Executive Inclusion Council. And that has been a delightful eye-opener for me. And I can tell you the last 2 years, particularly with the things that have accelerated with technology usage and adoption with COVID and remote working, what we've been able to do is to bring disability inclusion to the forefront. And I am very proud of the efforts that Principal has done with that. What we're doing is basically saying, we want to take the technology, things that have become much more common tooling, and we want to integrate that into providing people with different voices, whether they're in employee resource groups then that are bringing ideas to product innovations that we have, or whether they're just frankly having all of us understand what inclusion can mean more. So style differences, physical differences, differences in how we communicate, and probably what's been most important, at least for me in terms of a learning, is differences in how people lead. I think one of the things I've heard at Principal, and I know we're taking extremely seriously, is I feel like this past year and a half, I've been able to make a contribution, whether it's including more notes on the side of a research paper that I've always wanted to share with my coworkers, whether it's feeling like I could make a contribution that wasn't dependent upon anyone knowing if I had any mobility issues at all, because we're all just on the screen at the same time talking about the same issues. So redefining what leadership looks like, what idea leadership looks like, what innovation leadership looks like. That's one of the things I'm probably the proudest of, is that we've taken our broad, I'm going to call them more diversity and inclusion efforts, and we've made them more directed towards people understanding what differences can look like and how those differences lead exactly to how you led this, Merrill, to strategic advantage. More ideas means better content in the end. And so that's one of the things that we're absolutely trying to get the flywheel kind of working faster on, is we want best ideas to win. And when the best ideas are all coming from sort of people who've had the same history, who've had the same life experiences, who have the same skill sets, you're absolutely not getting a diverse enough set of those ideas. So this has been a great experience for Principal to accelerate, still not doing enough, and we can get to that later, but Principal has accelerated their ability to capture the best ideas and to get them into production so that they're actually helping our customers.
This is Merrill speaking. Thank you, Amy. I think that's great. We just, I cut out a little bit early to come, to this discussion with everybody here, but we were having a discussion across the leadership within Anthem about how to lead through hybrid, workforces and create hybrid environments that are inclusive, and how you include everybody. And it really does cast a long shadow of our leadership if we are more inclusive, and are we including people with different experiences and how to do this. And you can't do it, right, if everybody has the same perspective. Completely agree. Thank you so much. And we will be back to you for details, as you said, further down the road. So Mike, I'm going to transition to you. And prior to asking the question that you may expect me to ask, I do want to just start with a different one, if you don't mind. And that is understanding you are the co-host of a podcast called Choose Inclusion, Addressing the Benefits of Diversity Inclusion. Can you share a little bit about the podcast before we bump into your first official question?
Sure. Thank you, Merrill, and truly honored to be part of today's panel discussion with Jessica and Amy, such leaders across the country. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I am I am a older middle-aged white guy. I think I have still mostly dark hair. I am blind, and I think I have a dark shirt on today. The podcast has been kind of a fun passion project that we kicked off with a couple of other diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders here in the Denver metro area. And our tagline is what happens when a blind man, a woman of color, and a wannabe Latino get together to talk about inclusion in the workplace. It's a pretty unique concept and very unique perspectives across the inclusion space. And it really has been a passion project for all three of us. Certainly not my full-time gig, but it's been a ton of fun. We've talked to individuals literally globally, from judges and actors and musicians to chief diversity officers. We've really had a pretty wide spectrum of individuals to talk about inclusion from multiple lenses. And obviously my unique lens is absolutely a lens that even with our guests, because if you talk about within the Fortune 10,000, the four main pillars of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and again, I was raised by a single mom. Like I get all of the very important initiatives that are out there, but the four main pillars are equity initiatives from a gender perspective, LGBTQIA plus initiatives, veterans, and then of course ethnicity. And all four are super important initiatives. And what's almost always omitted in the Fortune 10,000 are kind of what I represent in the broader picture of what I do for a full-time job. And that is from the professionals with disabilities community, making sure that we have a voice at the talent acquisition table across enterprises. And that is like Hess being done.
I think that's exciting. I cannot wait to tune in. I'm going to go check it out. So hopefully everybody will too. Thank you. And I think that really does tee up your question, because you are on the front lines of advancing the careers of people with disabilities. So if you can talk a little bit about that win-win proposition for the employees and the companies, that would be great, please. This is Merrill talking.
Oh, thank you, Merrill. Well, it's so my background is as I would say I'm tech, I'm nerd. My background, I was a coder developer way back in the early mid 90s with the first kind of tech bubble. If anybody's old enough to remember Y2K, that first tech bubble started, early mid 90s. And if you could spell Y2K and you had any kind of coding aptitude, you were pretty much guaranteed a gig. And that's how I started off my career. Moved over to the network side, so Cisco certified. So again, most of my career is just all tech, but I was always the token blind person. So for nearly 20 years in the private sector, Fortune 5, Fortune 600 organizations, and I led 7- and 8-figure projects. Like I wasn't just the token blind person that was kept in a corner. I was very successful in my career. As you guys all know, private sector, I was a 6-figure engineer. You don't get paid that as a token. Like I was very, very productive. But it was always evident to me that I was the token blind person in any organization I was in. And so started doing some due diligence as a good engineer should, recognizing there are a ton of really good organizations across the country, mostly in the public sector, and then of course nonprofits that are working with not only the blind, visually impaired, the greater professionals with disabilities community. But I couldn't really find any of them that were really taking the business case to the Fortune 10,000, taking it to the C-suite about the super marginalized community being a true asset for an organization's bottom line and culture, and that is the professionals with disabilities community. And BIT, Blind Institute of Technology, we act as a nonprofit staffing agency. So organizations, small and large, from JP Morgan Chase and Salesforce and Anthem now, they pay us, CVS, they Allstate, they pay us to help them find talent within the professionals with disabilities community. And so literally from vice president down to tier 1 customer care, we help organizations with exactly that. Those who are truly interested in getting inclusive from the professionals with disabilities community, that's what we help with. Mike Hess is done.
Thank you, Mike. And if I get off my mute, I can keep going here, right? Thank you for sharing that. And I think it really is, some of the success about increasing the pipeline and ensuring that, people with disabilities are having that opportunity to advance at all levels and to be hired, into companies is being intentional, right? And so we have to be intentional in our hiring across DEI. So appreciate the work that you're doing, and glad that we are starting to work with you as well. Okay, so let's move on just a little bit and talk about some of the top ways in which we engage the private sector on the connection between disability inclusion and long-term value creation. So we'll dig in a little bit here, and Amy, as I promised earlier, I'm going to come back to you. But when you speak with your peers, right, in other companies and those companies who want to emulate the successes of Principal, how do you start that conversation and move them along in explaining the connection between disability inclusion and that value creation? And then what is that evidence? So there's always, there's two questions in the one question. What is the evidence you point to as to why disability inclusion is so critically important to business strategies and to customer base?
Sure. Thank you, Merrill. This is Amy Frederick again speaking. So I'm going to start with, there's sort of this sort of popular kind of culture thing going on about like grit in the workplace. I think of it more formally as things like resilience. I think what we've learned in the past 2 years, if we hadn't already learned it, is that those employees and those leaders that have more natural or even it's been a developed resilience, who are more resilient and who have more of that sort of culturally popular sort of that thing that people are calling grit and writing stories about, and leaders with grit and things like that. I think you don't even have to look any further than that. And because what I would say is that this population, in terms of looking at including disabled populations, people with disabilities, they score higher, period, end of story. Their resilience, walking into the gate, walking into the job, is literally higher. Their ability to weather technology difficulties, their ability to weather things that sort of throw people off. I can guarantee you they've probably dealt with something on a scale of 1 to 10, sitting up at an 8, 9, or 10, whereas other people are still struggling to deal with things that are a 2 or 3 or 4. So I would say perspective and resilience is one of the things I come back to as a profile and characteristic type that we want not only from every worker, we want it off our best, highest leadership. So I want to give the biggest organizational problems at the highest stress times to the people who have the best resilience. What I can tell you is there's a business case that is stunningly strong in terms of that correlation. And so when people ask, is it worth it? And Merrill, you made some really interesting remarks, and I always sort of wince when I think of it. Like, is this charity? What do we have to do? Should we put something to, it's like, oh, that's just, it's no, you're missing the point completely. When we start with style differences, background differences, capability differences, make us stronger, and you add that there's people who come into the equation with naturally better sets of resilience, there's no further business case to be made. Part of it is just sort of removing the initial bias that there's so many either accommodations or special circumstances we'll have to take into account. And what I can tell you is I think that the things we've done to enable remote technology have been amazing in terms of just taking some of those things. Previously, we would have thought of them as a special accommodation, and we've put them in the category of normal setup to have people do great work, anybody with any skill sets to do great work. So I would say the business case when I make it is that not only are we getting the things previously mentioned, creativity and problem solving, we're getting grit, we're getting resilience, and we're getting sort of immediate adoption of things that previously have been technologies that are looked at as more of an accommodation. So I think, you know, the time is right. And so I don't have to go much further than that in the discussion to say that there's a business case there. Amy, Frederick, done.
Thank you, Amy. This is Merrill again. You know, and I love the fact that we are all starting to bristle when we hear the word charity, right? And we use it intentionally almost to prove a point at this particular, you know, stage, which I think is great. And I think it does show part of the evolution and where we are getting to with the inclusion of people with disabilities and eliminating words like special and charity. And so I think it is really critically important that the taxonomy, the lexicon comes along with us, right? And I love that you talk about resiliency. We say, you know, one of the strongest characteristics and pillars, even with Anthem, is agility. And I think as somebody who identifies a disability as, you know, ADHD, boy, we got to be agile, right? We have to be resilient. And when creating technology, you talked about that, it include people in the development, right, of technology resources so that we know that they work for people with disabilities. Okay.
Merrill, can I, Merrill, I just want to make a comment. I'm building on Amy's.
So this is Jessica speaking, and
I'm
Merrill's going to stop speaking for a moment. Go ahead, Jessica.
This is Jessica Tuman speaking again. Sorry, I was just going to build on what Amy just said and what we were just talking about around resiliency and accommodations. You know, one thing that we have found today is that many people, I think there's a misconception about accommodations. Many people with disabilities come with their own accommodations. They have their assistive devices. The investment is usually very small from, you know, a company. It may be lighting or changing the lighting or, you know, a button or a press to open a door. Those accommodations, I think there's this misconception that we're going to have to change so much of our buildings and facilities. And now with remote work, the accommodations costs are actually kind of minimal. And we've done some research with the Society for Human Resource Management, and the average accommodation cost for someone with a disability is around $500. So it's not a huge, it is not a huge amount of investment to hire someone with a disability. A couple of other things I wanted to mention as well is that in that research with the Society for Human Resource Management, SHRM, we found that people with disabilities are more loyal in the workplace. And we are all dealing with retention issues and staff turnover and, you know, employees leaving. It's incredibly costly to replace people. Employees. So that's, you know, just another great attribute and asset when you do hire someone with a disability, and they perform better. And some tasks are better for people that have, you know, when you introduce neurodiversity, there are jobs that people with, you know, some disabilities are just so much better at doing than neurotypical folks. So I just wanted to make mention of those attributes and factors that help you know, create that environment where we do engage better and we have more resiliency and we have better product development because we have that representation. So I'll stop talking now.
Jessica, this is Merrill. You were up next anyway, so stay off mute if you don't mind. But if you can talk a little bit about how investors are looking across their investment portfolios to the diversity and inclusion commitments and outcomes and what that means for companies in which they invest.
Sure. And, you know, as an asset manager, and Amy is one too, principal in Voya, we look at what we call ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors. And we are pushing, the companies are pushing to become more and more ESG integration within ESG in their portfolios. This is something that is growing. Companies like BlackRock and Invesco have committed a date like 2020 and 2023 for full ESG integration. And what that means, ESG is really all about environmental, social, and governance. And for us as an asset manager and as a retirement firm, we know that we're not going to make a massive impact in the environmental and governance. We don't get poor ratings or reviews, but we're not also a manufacturer. We're an investor. So we investment management firms. So we focus very heavily on the social responsibility and the social impacts that we can make. And one of the, Voya Cares is a perfect proof point of the social impact and responsibility that we have and we make, and commitment that we make in hiring people with disabilities, providing them financial literacy, guidance and solutions, accommodations at work, and advocacy with not-for-profit organizations like Disability In. We have a special relationship with the National Down Syndrome Society as well. And we really use our platform to provide, all of those things in the disabilities community. And you will see that participants, investors, other stakeholders are pushing for this ESG integration in their portfolios. So this is just growing. And I think that companies that can actually, show and demonstrate their commitments to all of these sort of aspects in terms of social impact are going to succeed and do well.
Thank you, Jessica. This is Merrill again. So Mike, as I get rolling here, that's your cue that you're up next here, move along. So the only way possibly that we can foster long-term value creation in companies and across society more broadly is if we dramatically change the dynamic on how people with disabilities are hired and integrated into the workforce. A little bit about what we talked, this intentionality, as well. How do we scale the hiring of people with disabilities across the entire economy? Right, lofty goals here, but the entire economy, and do so quickly, right? Let's say in more imminently in the next few years versus, starting and trying to build up incrementally. We've been doing this for a while. So what's the infusion here? How do we do this?
It's a great question, Merrill, and this is Mike Hess again. And I love, and it's actually very, this is a great question kind of on the heels of both Amy and Jessica talking about accommodations. So fundamentally, like I sell professionals with disabilities. Like that's basically what I do. It sounds just, oh, okay, cool. You're just out there hustling bodies. Like, I don't know how many tens of thousands of, shops that are out there that do talent, right? However, if you look for the organizations that are actually successful, actually getting professionals with disabilities hired on, like it is a really, really, really small list. And so much of it comes down to the how, because it's great to say like, oh, I'm a blind developer and I've done this and I've managed 7- and 8-figure projects and I've done this and I've been network engineer and I've done this. That sounds so great, but so many people are like, but how? How do you do that? How does a blind coder do X? How does a deaf data analyst do Y? How does somebody who's neurodiverse? How does somebody who's got a prosthetic? It's always this how. So much of what we do is explain to organizations how somebody like me does work and add value to an organization's bottom line and culture. And so so much like the reasonable accommodation, people ask like, okay, well, so how does somebody who's totally blind become a Salesforce admin or a Salesforce developer? How does that happen? How? And so we always help organizations get over that how hump. And literally demonstrate how somebody who's blind, somebody who's deaf does these very technical things. How does somebody who's never managed somebody who's blind or deaf create accessible digital media? Right? If you've never done that before, let us get you over that. And so we always start with education, helping people get over that how hump. Because guess what? Organizations like Salesforce, like Google, like Microsoft, like AWS, like Adobe, they've already solved for so much of this. So the reasonable accommodation, guess what? Your organization already has most of it. Workday has already done their, pieces of what they're doing. Like, so it's helping organizations realize like the reasonable accommodation, let's get over like, and we know this, like that reasonable accommodation is a legal term. And so HR professionals are there to help mitigate risk. Let's call it what it is. And however, but if they don't really know how it is that professionals with disabilities do what they do, and if they're interviewing somebody that's blind or deaf for the first time, like you have 2 minutes to really make a good impression. We all know that within that interview process. And if you're in your own brain kind of really squishy, what I call squishy around that conversation of like, okay, I don't know how a blind person is going to be able to do this, or a deaf person is going to do that, and I've got to get 60 people hired on this month, like, and if you're still struggling with some of those how questions, of course people with disabilities are going to be passed up on. Like, that's just part of it. So everything that we do lead, like, to do this at scale, education. And I'm not just talking, like paid for education. Blind Institute of Technology offers completely free education, because our end mission as a nonprofit is to get people employed. So we lead with completely free education to help scale this conversation within organizations who have never had to overcome that how question. And so to do this at scale, we need to educate more hiring managers, more leaders, period, more of the C-suite on how professionals with disabilities do what they do, and how the reasonable accommodations that we require, your organization already has. Mike Hess is done.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. And I may be quoting you on the how hump. Going forward, I think that, and I see that, Amy and Jessica are agreeing in that as well. It is getting people over that how hump. Can't tell you how many times we've heard the question, like, how do we find people with disabilities who want to work? I'm like, this part should not, be the question, right? We all furrow our brows, at that particular question. So it's great to have partners across the community, then across the country that can really help just myth bust, right? We need to do a lot of myth busting still, as I call it, in terms of getting over the how hump as well. So
and I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Mike, please.
Well, and part of the reason why Anthem partnered, we went through the procurement process and become, an actual talent acquisition vendor to Anthem, is because Anthem already had like 1 or 2 really positive use cases of completely blind people doing customer care work. Again, competitive integrated employment work for Anthem. And so when I found that out, that Anthem had already made the investment from an accessibility perspective, digital accessibility perspective, I then asked the question, I said, so how are those teammates actually performing in your group? And the hiring manager, or the manager said, I wish I had 50 more of those particular people. And I said, well, that's what we can help you with.
Oh, we got this.
So that's the thing. It's like, so the data is there to support, like, this is not charity. This is a business case of finding talent that, by the way, we do not job hop, because we don't have that same luxury as other individuals, other marginalized communities do. We cannot job hop. Unfortunately, in the Fortune 500, it's a small percentage of Anthems that are there saying, no, this is part of our mantra. So sorry, I'm off my bandwagon. Mike Hess out.
No, bandwagon's welcome. It is all good. One day I'll tell you the story of about, 14 years ago when we first implemented JAWS and what happened. but we've got it down now. So
Hey,
this is Merrill. My
this
apologies.
is Amy Frederick. Merrill,
Amy.
can I add something in? Because this is Amy. I so loved what Mike was saying, and so I'm going to do a little bit of just sort of reflection on where I think we can get better. I do think everyone, when they're faced with someone who has a disability, and again, they just immediately go to, how are we going to supervise? How are we going to hire? How are we going to have, just do sort of the daily things? What I would argue is, I've been given opportunities where I didn't know how to supervise actuaries. I didn't know how to supervise underwriters. I would argue that's a pretty highly technical piece. I needed some special skills. I probably needed something extra, but no one worried about that. They still went ahead, did the hire, put me in the role, and assumed we would, find our way to something that's very productive. And so I think sometimes we need to do more of that. I think we don't let that keep us from some style or skill differences that we know we probably need to do some special training and special skill building for, but we let it keep us from doing things like, hiring people who have, neuro or different cognitive abilities. And so I really feel like we need to, it's a mindset shift. It definitely has some functional pieces that we have to make work. Technology has to work, supervision has to work, those types of things. But I think if the mindset's in the right place, we're a creative bunch in the, not that the public sector is not, but private sector industry, you get rewarded, the economics favor you if you can start moving quickly on solving those problems. So we tend to be a fairly creative bunch, but we tend not to take that first step. And I think taking that first step that we will do for people who have, frankly, a set of skill sets that feel a little bit more mainline in terms of what we've historically experienced, we'll take that leap there and we won't in other places. And so we really need to work on shifting our mindset on that. Amy out.
Amy, thank you. And Jessica, I'm going to come over to you in a minute too, because I'm sure you have something to add here as well. But I think, the point is nobody would being, working in Anthem and work with actuaries. I mean, that would have been the more obvious question, like, how do you manage an actuary, right? But nobody asked that question, but we ask it around disability. Such an important point, such a part of the narrative that needs to be changed. So this is Merrill. I'm done, and I'm going to turn it over to Jessica, please, to weigh in if you.
Sure. Yeah. I'm dying to say something. This is Jessica.
I love it.
It's so nice to hear all the things that I talk about on a daily basis and just to hear it from other, leaders in other companies. But what you were saying, Amy, about all of that is at a company level, externally, your company needs to be known to be disability friendly. However you do that, you need to make sure that you appeal to that disability community, to the disabilities community. I'll tell you one thing, the generation below us, they seek and they look at company websites. They look at for, accessibility statements on the landing pages on your, company home website. They'll look for, images of people with disabilities. You got to make sure that you appeal this disabilities community externally, otherwise you're not going to be hired. You've got to be known for that. Associations with, organizations like Disability In and others are really important for you to sort of project that externally. And I think we've done a pretty good job in sort of being known for that. I know Voya is, we're all supportive of these types of organizations, but this attracts talent. As you were talking about, Mike, earlier, which companies are going to hire people with disabilities. So if you want that talent and you need that talent, and we all do, we want it because it creates better services and solutions, representation for all our product development, you're going to have to project that externally. And talking in forums like this and having leaders to talk about disability inclusion is so important. The other thing I wanted to mention is that as you were talking about, Mike, in the hiring process, and just as an awareness around, for hiring managers and the folks in recruitment, often they have no idea that, they're talking to someone with a disability, and self-identification is so important in that recruitment and hiring process. And then also training the hiring managers to actually be able to, talk to someone with a disability, someone with autism, whatever it might be, over the phone, so that they can shine in these interviews, because interviews over a phone or Zoom is not always easy, right? It's not always easy for those with intellectual disabilities, whatever it might be. So I think those two components, be known for as a company that embraces people with disabilities, be public about it, show it on your website, have imagery on your marketing materials, and then make sure that you internally educate hiring managers, recruitment folks, and just generally sort of elevate disability inclusion in the language. One thing that we did do when we started Voya Cares is we recognized that So many people just felt uncomfortable even engaging with someone with a visible disability. Most Americans, 54% of Americans, are uncomfortable. So the first thing we did was to educate folks on disability etiquette. Language is important, people first language, the use of labels, how to engage with someone that uses a wheelchair. We wanted to blow all those stereotypes out as well. You know, the typical image you have of someone who has a disability is a visible one, a wheelchair user, someone with a prosthetic leg or an arm, or, you know, someone with a congenital, very visible disability. And I think that's the first fundamental step in disability inclusion in a company. And it's part of our onboarding as well. So as we hire employees, they go through this training. So I think that's just a really important aspect of how you include people, using the right language and disability etiquette as being a sort of fundamental basis to sort of start that process and make that change within your company. I'm done.
Jessica, thank you for your comments. You know, I think we have to, right, and sometimes we forget how critically important it is to bring it up again, because we feel like we do it all the time, but we have to offer disability competency training. Absolutely. We have to, you know, get that out there, whether it be people first language or identity first language or interactions or the words that we use when we talk to, with, and about people, and the images. It's so incredibly important. We will never be able, why would people with disabilities want to come work for a company, right, that doesn't look like, you know, it is inclusive, right, and truly, you know, embraces and embeds people with disability, you know, throughout the entirety of it. So I think you are very right, and we can't lose sight of the fact, you know, of that training. One of the other important points that everybody's touched on a little bit differently is leadership, and leadership speaking about disability inclusion, right, and including it, you know, for those of us who are, you know, have made our commitment to the valuable 500, you know, but ensuring that disability employment and disability inclusion, you know, is on the agenda for, you know, the entire hierarchy, you know, of companies. You talk a little bit how you know, encourage leadership to embrace disability inclusion and disability employment. We, you know, have about 8 minutes left, but I'd love to get some great thoughts from all of you so that people have something to take away, you know, on how to get their leadership to talk about disability inclusion and employment at a high level too. So Amy, I'm gonna start with you, please. This is Merrill. Done speaking.
Sure. Thanks, Merrill. This is Amy. So I'm gonna turn the question just a little bit, and why I'm gonna turn it just a little bit is because I do think there's some of these very, very practical things that actually, if you see me looking down, I'm making some notes for myself that I'm going to follow up and make sure we're doing all these things, as well as I'm hearing you and Mike and Jessica articulate them. So I'm going to follow up on some of those things. I think that the piece that strikes me for leadership is that we have so many of these, often unconscious, but there's really biases about sort of what we've embedded in even identification of what makes a leader. So forget about trying to tell other leaders how they should recognize talent. We need to recognize that leadership itself has to look a little bit different moving forward. Well, it doesn't have to, but if it doesn't look different, we're not getting the richness there.
It has to
take advantage of. So it doesn't have to look different, but it should look different. So when I think of historical definitions of leadership, and again, as a woman, as a female, I fight against some of these things that I feel sort of historical definitions of leadership. So, you know, when I walk into a room of other leaders of insurance businesses across the industry, they're really not expecting a blonde woman to come trotting in. They're just really not. So that definition of leadership sort of gets blown a little bit. So when we think about how we think about identifying those leadership characteristics, promoting people differently, I do think we need to lean off some of our historical things about, you know, articulating things this way as an executive skill. Having in-person charisma like this is an executive skill. Being influential in person is an executive skill. I think we need to redefine and really relook at our executive skill sets, because bringing forward different ideas, maybe having a different level of charisma that's not based on a personal presentation, having a different set of articulation about how you make a contribution that's not all sort of speaking cadence and style. We've got to be harder on ourselves about what biases we have embedded in saying someone has executive leadership potential, because I think it's exclusionary. So we need to figure that out better than we have. And some of the richest conversations I've had are when we're testing ourselves on what assumptions we're making about who makes a future leader. And I think from an inclusion population, this is going to make a huge difference. So Amy, off my soapbox on that.
No, come on, we're sticking with the soapbox as welcome here. Thank you. This is Merrill again, and we do need to be held accountable for that. I completely agree. And I think that's a great topic to hopefully include in other discussions. But I do want to make sure this question does sort of get posed in our next couple of minutes. We have about 3 before we'll make some closing comments and find ways to get resources on all of you out to people. That is one of the questions that's been asked in the Q&A. But Mike, can we call on you next?
Sure. So for me, everything is about being intentional. The organizations that we find to be most successful, and this is, I look at leadership, so I look at, there's a difference between like leadership and the title that you have. So I look at leadership a little bit differently, because leadership is, to me, action. And so regardless of what your pedigree is, whether you're, regardless of any of that and how successful you've been, for me, it's always about action, and the action that anybody can take to be successful with this. Like this, right here, this isn't vaporware. This isn't like, oh, someday we can do this. No, this is right now. And it's about being intentional. And I stopped asking organizations a long time ago, so how many blind people do you have working for you? How many people that are deaf do you have working for you? How many, and I understand this is like an HR conversation, but guess what? I mean, here's my cane. I'm shaking my cane around. I stick out. Okay. So, and most people who are visually impaired or blind, they absolutely are easy to identify. Same with folks who are deaf or hard of hearing. It is people that are in wheelchairs. I stopped asking that question because it's uncomfortable silence, or I get the, oh, we have this one. I'm like, okay, well, let's change that narrative. What if you were to say like, oh, we have this one African American who works with us, or we have this one woman who works with us. Like, let's change that narrative around. And so to me, like, leadership is action, and it's being super intentional about saying, no, like, we're not just talking. This isn't lip service. This isn't marketing material. And I do agree, like, the messaging, Jessica, is super, super important. But it's got to be like, we get retained to say, hey, we want to know how our onboarding process is. We need to know that the hardest use case, somebody who is totally blind, can actually apply for a job in our organization. So to me, those are really actionable things. So leaders need to be intentional. Mike Hess out.
Yes, thank you, Mike. And intentionality is my thing. So completely concur. Jessica, I hate to do this to you, but 35 to 55 seconds, maybe. Please weigh in. You've made so many great points across the way. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Jessica Tuman here again. I think when leaders can be open about their own disabilities, that is one of the most powerful things that a CEO or any senior leader in a company can do. Self-identification is so critical and important. And what happens when you do self-identify, or people know that I'm in this business of inclusion, they start telling me all the stories about their siblings or their moms or their children that have a disability. And I cannot think of a better way to connect with someone on a human level. So it just opens that conversation, because we're all connected to the disabilities community. We all have a story, and having that story up front and telling that story just creates that incredible relationship right from the very beginning. So I think leadership, being open about it, self-identifying about it. In our company, our CEO is very open about disabilities and inclusion, and it cascades down into the organization. So that's my one pearl of wisdom, Merrill, today. And with
Jessica, thank you. Thank you so much. This is Merrill. I hate when our hour, starts to wrap. These need to be at least 90 minutes. We can carry our disability pride, following, from where Jesse was just speaking. There's so much pride in who we are. as people with disabilities and to be able to promote that. Thank you all so much. You guys are just incredible. And I hope we continue this conversation. The good news is there's more in the series. So our next discussion will be a really, really, really cool one with Eddie Ndobu, our friend and co-collaborator in the panel series. We'll host a one-on-one fireside chat interview with Rose Kerr. Rose is Verizon's Chief Corporate Social Responsibility Officer. Don't miss this one either. Please tune in on September 22nd during the United Nations Global Goals Week. They'll cover topics like reimagining the discourse pertaining to building back better in a way that centers disability justice and intersectionality. How can disability be reimagined to create value? What is the value of disability? You know, we can do that one. What needs to happen to drive meaningful representation in the boardroom and in the C-suite? It's going to be a fantastic conversation. We can't wait to listen to it ourselves. Please stay tuned. Thank you so much for everybody who joined us today, our incredible panelists, our hosts. We hope that you all stay well, stay healthy, and tune back in with us another time. We are very grateful for you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.